Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today we're going to talk about this paper called Hunter-Gatherers as Models in Public Health. And what this paper discusses, it's a review article that summarizes many previous studies that have looked at the health benefits of living natural lifestyles. So specifically, they look at many different hunter-gatherer populations, which are exactly what it sounds like. These are human populations which still exist in various parts of the world today that are undeveloped. So they get their resources and their nutrients directly from their environment via hunting or gathering vegetation. Okay? And they're basically more healthy by a wide variety of different metrics. So they have lower rates of obesity, lower rates of diabetes, better cardiovascular health, better lung health and lung function, and lower risk of many other chronic diseases. Okay, so this paper starts to explore why that's the case. The answer is they have different diets, they have different levels of exercise, they have more outdoor time, they're closer knit with their community, and things like that. And all of that is thought to contribute to their superior health. Now, the reason this paper matters is because people tend to have the impression that we used to be a less healthy species. So the idea is that if you go further back in time, humans were a disease-ridden species that was constantly encumbered by infectious diseases and other things like that. And that as time has gone on and as we've advanced, and as technology and medicine have advanced, we've gotten healthier. Well, that turns out not to be the case. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. As we advance, our population becomes less healthy. We're getting higher rates of autoimmune disease, higher rates of obesity, higher rates of heart failure, lung disease, liver disease, kidney disease, hypertension, even mental health issues are increasing. So we're becoming less healthy over time. And this paper helps sort of correct the record and correct the idea that we are actually progressing as a species. We're not. Okay, so if we're going to correct our species' declining health, then we need to basically incorporate lessons from hunter-gatherers, which is what this title is encapsulating, and incorporate that into our own lifestyles. So we need to be spending more time outdoors. We need to be eating healthier foods, more direct, natural foods, and things like that, avoiding pollution. All of these interventions and more are necessary to make our population healthy. Okay, and obviously making your population healthy is a central objective of any civilization, because everything that a civilization does is downstream of the health of its population. So, think of any job in society. It requires high mental function or physical function, all of which depends on proper health. So it's kind of obvious, but if we're going to survive and thrive as a civilization, then we need to make sure that we're healthy physically and mentally. Another reason this paper matters is because there's this idea that nature is a deeply corrupt or broken or flawed system, and that we need to artificialize our environments if we're going to save ourselves from nature. Okay, I think that's another completely backwards idea. I think nature is inherently good. I think that even the diseases, like infectious diseases, they have a net benefit, which we might talk about as we go through this paper. And the natural environment is full of natural medicines in the form of like fruits and vegetables and even meat-based foods. So I think it just corrects a lot of misconceptions about nature, the natural lifestyle, and health and disease. So it's very important. All right, so let's get into the paper. They start off by talking about how there's sort of two competing worldviews. One is that life used to be better in the past and that it's slowly getting worse. And the other is that life used to be bad and that it's slowly getting better. This paper takes the former approach. It argues that life used to be good, we used to be healthy, and that industrialization has basically slowly corrupted our population and made us less healthy. And there's some evidence for this that they talk about. So again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of chronic diseases are increasing in frequency. In fact, these diseases are actually referred to as diseases of civilization because they tend to appear only after civilization is developed. They're not natural aspects of our species. They're not inherent in our biology. Rather, they tend to manifest whenever we leave the natural environment and into an artificial environment. Okay, so they seem to be caused by an environmental shift associated with artificialization. Okay, again, we mentioned some of the diseases earlier, but this includes things like diabetes, obesity, cancer, heart disease, and many others. And they talk about how if we're going to understand the cause of these diseases, we need to basically look to hunter-gatherer populations where these diseases are relatively absent. So if we're going to figure out which environmental factors are contributing to these, we need to look at an environment where they're absent and figure out what are the environmental differences between hunter-gatherers and ourselves. And so that's the goal of this paper. Like I said, they mainly summarize other people's studies, but then they also do publish a little bit of original research on this population, this hunter-gatherer population in Tanzania, which is in Africa. So first they talk about the lifespan in hunter-gatherer populations. I think this is probably the biggest misconception. They say that the average lifespan is in their 30s and 40s in hunter-gatherer populations. And so that's what most people think of when they think of ancient humans or when they think of hunter-gatherer populations or pre-industrialized society. They hear that low average lifespan and they think that that indicates poor health in these populations. In reality, this number doesn't tell the full story because, as they say here, this is caused largely by high infant mortality. In other words, a lot of people die when they're like 1 or 2 years old or even younger from infectious diseases, and therefore the average life expectancy drops extensively. They say later, and we'll get to it, but the mode life expectancy, which is like the most common age at which people die in these populations, is about 72 years old. So as long as you make it through infancy, you're likely to live a relatively long and normal life, which is on par with modern populations. You might be thinking, what about that high infant mortality from infectious diseases? Isn't that evidence that these people are less healthy? Well, the answer is not really. Infectious diseases actually serve an important purpose. Namely, they remove infants not at random, so it's not like infants randomly get infected and die. They specifically target infants that have some sort of biological defect that makes them more likely to be less healthy in the future. Okay, so we might have to talk more about that in future videos, but I actually wrote an entire book about this during the COVID pandemic called Purposeful Pathogens, which discusses how pathogens tend to infect people of certain lifestyle variables, and they tend to infect infants that have received poor environmental programming from their parents. So infants that are gestated in an unhealthy mother, they're more likely to be infected by infectious diseases and removed from the population. Okay, and so you can think of these as a quality control mechanism. It might seem harsh to think of infant mortality as being a quality control mechanism and a net positive. But again, this is a mechanism by which nature is removing people from the population that are most likely to grow up and be dysfunctional or harmful to the society. So again, it seems harsh, and I understand that, but it's probably a net benefit. Okay, so it's almost like a filter mechanism where only the fittest infants make it through infancy, and then they grow up, and then they tend to live healthy lives until their 60s and 70s. So don't get fooled by that misconception. The average doesn't tell the full story. And by the way, you can find that book on Amazon. It talks about all kinds of different lifestyle factors that influence health, including exercise, diet, sleep, vitamin D, and spending time outdoors, avoiding pollution, psychological stress, things like that. So infectious diseases don't target people at random. They target specific individuals based on specific causes, most of which are environmental. And importantly, they say here, it's not just extant hunter-gatherer populations, so those that are around today. They say analysis of fossil evidence suggests the proportion of adults surviving to 40 plus years has been stable since the Upper Paleolithic, approximately 50,000 years ago. So in other words, people, again, I hear this all the time, that the average life expectancy, thousands of years ago was 20 or 30. And then people take this to mean that everyone's dying when they hit 20 years old. That's not true. That's the average. The true life expectancy, if you look at something like the mode, it's in the 60s and 70s. If you make it past infancy in your childhood, you're likely to live a relatively old life. So then they look at what actually causes death in these populations. Again, by far the most common cause of death in hunter-gatherer populations is acute illness. These are infectious diseases mostly. And once again, you think, well, doesn't that just mean they're unhealthy? Not necessarily. Again, I would reference the same book, Purposeful Pathogens, which talks specifically about what environmental factors lead an individual to be likely to get infected. It's not random. Infectious diseases don't target people at random. They infect specific people based on specific causes as a population quality control mechanism. So infectious diseases are a good thing and we should be happy about their existence. They say another 20% are killed by trauma, including accidents and violence. Most importantly, they say the percentage of deaths from chronic non-communicable, that basically just means non-infectious, diseases common in developed countries like heart disease, metabolic disease, and cancers are very low in small-scale populations. Less than 10% of deaths, even for individuals over 60 years old. So chronic disease really isn't that significant in these populations. And so now they're going to talk about multiple different types of diseases in these populations, starting with obesity. So they say, as expected for populations with high levels of physical activity and limited access to processed, highly caloric foods, obesity and metabolic disease are rare among hunter-gatherers and subsistence farmers. Down here they say, fewer than 2% of Hadza, that's one of the several hunter-gatherer populations that they look at, fewer than 2% of the adults of this group qualify as overweight. So it's very low. Again, in our society, it's like 50% of people are overweight or obese. Regarding body fat, they say men's body fat percentage is considerably lower, 8.6% among adults greater than 20 years old. So that's a very low body fat percentage. So they're lean, muscular, and healthy. All right. It's not just like some random tribe in Africa that had these metabolic benefits. They talk about some of the other tribes and other populations in different locations around the world, including South America and North America. So they talk about the Amish. So they say researchers have found similar BMI, body mass index, and body fat percentage among traditional old order Amish who farm without machine assistance. So again, these people are extremely physically active and they're extremely metabolically fit. It's not that surprising. Okay. One thing is they say that in some of these populations, there is a decent amount of overweight people, but it's not due to them being fat. It's because the way that they classify them as overweight is based on body mass index. And that basically doesn't really differentiate between fat and muscle. So basically, if somebody is short and stocky with muscle, they might be classified as overweight or obese, even if they're not fat. And so that's what is happening in these cases. So even though there are some people classified as overweight in these healthy hunter-gatherer populations and Amish populations, that's because of the BMI measurement that's being used. So they say BMI may overestimate adiposity, that means basically fatness, among some small-scale societies, presumably due to their relatively greater muscle mass. So BMI measurements is misinterpreting muscle as fat. These people are muscular and lean. They say here, non-insulin dependent type 2 diabetes is so rare among small-scale populations that it is difficult to find reports of its prevalence in these groups. So they do find some, and it's less than 1% of people in these populations have diabetes. Again, extremely metabolically healthy. All right, they provide some data on that here. So this is showing the mass of people in hunter-gatherer, a specific hunter-gatherer population across age. So the x-axis in each of these graphs is age. The y-axis is various different things depending on which particular panel you're looking at. So this is basically just body weight or body mass in kilograms. The blue line is the males. Each dot is a different individual. The line is the average. So, you know, this is just showing that males a little bit heavier than females, but ultimately they're not heavy by our standards. It also shows BMI, also shows skin folds. That's a measure of basically how fat they are. Same with fat percentage. The females have higher fat percentage than the males in these populations, which isn't surprising. That's a normal gender difference. But ultimately, the main takeaway from this is just that these populations are extremely metabolically fit. Okay, we don't need to get bogged down by the specific numbers. Next, they go on to talk about cardiovascular disease. So they say hunter-gatherers and subsistence farming populations are notable for their remarkable cardiovascular health. Heart and vascular disease account for a negligible portion of deaths in these populations, even among adults over 60 years old. So that's another thing you hear. Sometimes people will hear that hunter-gatherer populations are healthier, and then they'll retort by saying, well, that's because everyone in these populations dies by the time they're like 20, and so there's no old people to be unhealthy. That's not true. Even when studies correct for that, they have very low rates of chronic disease. And it's worth pointing out that heart disease is one of the major causes of death. It's one of the most common causes of death in developed societies. And these populations have basically none of that. So regarding hypertension, that's chronically high blood pressure, they say more than 60% of U.S. adults 60 plus years are hypertensive, while less than 30% of hunter-gatherers and subsistence farmers, like that would be like the Amish, who are 60 years or older, show even mild hypertension. They don't have high blood pressure. Okay. Here they talk about VO2 max, which is a measure of lung function. Basically, the higher the better. They're citing another paper that looked at 7 hunter-gatherer populations and subsistence farmer populations. And what they observed is a VO2 max of 56.7 versus ours, or rather Canadian men in modern developed populations, which is only 37.9. So you can see it's much higher in the hunter-gatherer populations. Again, you don't need to worry about like what exactly this entails, but this is just a measure of lung function. Hunter-gatherers and people living in natural environments have significantly better lung function than we do in developed societies. So far we've seen they have better metabolic fitness, they have better cardiac health, and they have better lung function. Okay, with this table, they talk about different parameters comparing 3 different hunter-gatherer populations. That's these top 3 rows, 2 adults in the United States, which is the bottom row. So for example, they look at like energy expenditure. They look at percent of their diet that comes from proteins versus carbohydrates versus fat. I'd say the main thing from this paper, they also look at blood pressure over here, but I would say the most important finding from this table is the cholesterol difference. So cholesterol, that's basically just lipids in your blood. Generally speaking, the higher your LDL, the worse your vascular health, the more likely you are to get hypertension or atherosclerosis or heart disease and things like that. And what you can see is that if you look at total cholesterol, it's significantly lower in all the hunter-gatherer populations compared to the United States adults. And this is especially true if you look at LDL. Again, that's like quote unquote the bad cholesterol, whereas HDL tends to be healthy cholesterol. But you look at the average LDL in the United States, it's more than double some of these hunter-gatherer populations. Okay, so we have much worse cholesterol than they do. All right, so again, just to emphasize the point, they say adults from this particular hunter-gatherer population show very low rates of hypertension with age and almost no evidence of peripheral artery disease, even for individuals over 60. They have the lowest prevalence of coronary artery disease ever reported. So again, it's just they're in a healthier environment, eating healthier foods, getting more exercise, and that's enough to make them extremely fit in terms of their cardiovascular health. Okay, unfortunately, they don't talk much about these other types of diseases. So, for example, they say they seem to have low cancer rates in hunter-gatherer populations, but that needs to be studied more. They also say that dementia seems to be low in these populations, but that also needs to be studied more. So you have to take that with a grain of salt for now. But it doesn't seem to just be cardiovascular diseases and metabolic diseases. It seems like most diseases are actually lower in hunter-gatherer populations compared to developed societies. All right, so why is that the case? Why are these populations healthier? Well, one obvious explanation is they have higher physical activity. So if you have to hunt for your food and if you have to go out and gather vegetation to feed yourself, then you're going to be getting more physical activity. So they cited a study here saying that this report showed that they get between 6 to 9 hours of walking and other physical activity per day for 2 hunter-gatherer populations. Okay, and that's one in Africa and one in South America. Likewise, in a paper that looked at the Amish, they say that they get around 8 hours a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, which includes walking. So these people are pretty active for most of the day. So again, it's no wonder that they're healthier. Okay, so they talk about some other studies that have looked at the amount of exercise they get in these populations. Okay, they say here that this particular population, the adults accumulate over 135 minutes of moderate and vigorous physical activity per day, which is several times more than adults in the United States and Europe. So that's shown down here in this next figure. So here, what this figure is showing is, again, going down by panel. Each panel shows a different parameter, and then within each panel, each different bar represents the population in a different country or a different population. So these first two dark gray bars are two different hunter-gatherer populations. And then each gray bar after that, the light gray bars, that's the different countries as is shown in this particular panel. So this one right here, this is South African populations. The next one is Ghanan populations. The next one is Japan, and so on. The United States is the third from the end. Then the two different, the left and right panels within each section, those are men and women respectively. So men are on the left, women are on the right. And what you can see is that when you look at the amount of physical activity, this is moderate to vigorous physical activity in terms of minutes per day. You compare the US or the Netherlands to these hunter-gatherer populations, and they get like double the amount of exercise that we do, if not triple. Okay, and it's even more pronounced for women. So that's the main takeaway from this figure. These other panels, they're less important for us right now, but we'll talk about this one briefly. So this TEE, that's total energy expenditure. Again, this is per day. This particular populations, for example, they expend around 2,500 calories per day. The United States, we expend roughly the same, maybe close to 2,200 calories per day. And this is interesting because even though these hunter-gatherer populations exercise like almost 3 times as much as we do, their total energy expenditure is not that much higher than ours. And what the authors speculate is that this means exercise, it's not just expending energy. Instead, it's rewiring our metabolism to make it more efficient. So it's devoting the same amount of calories to different physiological tasks to make our bodies basically more efficient. So it's not a very important point, but it is interesting. Okay, and then we're going to skip ahead quite a bit. So that's all physical activity. They have more physical activity in hunter-gatherer populations, and that seems to be rewiring their metabolism to make them more efficient. The next obvious difference between them and us is their diet. So they say here, dietary diversity among hunter-gatherers is so vast that dietary universals are few. What they mean by that is hunter-gatherer populations, they don't all have like the same diet. So what these two graphs here are showing, figure 3, they're showing basically the percent of diet for a hunter-gatherer population that comes from plant-based foods in this figure versus percent of the diet that comes from animal-based foods in this figure. And it's as a function of latitude. So basically, the further away from the equator a population resides, the less it gets their nutrients from plants and the more they get it from food. So if you think about a hunter-gatherer population in like the Arctic, okay, almost all of their food comes from like fish and seals and stuff like that. So it's extremely meat-based. Whereas populations near the tropics, near the equator, they have roughly equal distribution of plant-based foods and animal-based foods. What's interesting is even though these populations have very different diets, they all have that good metabolic fitness and that cardiovascular fitness. So diet is clearly important, but you can't reduce hunter-gatherer diet to one single thing. It's not mostly plants, it's not mostly animals. It depends on the population, and either can be healthy. Okay, so they say here, all human groups cook their food and appear to have done so for at least the past 250,000 years. Nearly all hunter-gatherer populations today and in the recent past are known to have a mix of both meat and plant foods in their diet. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead. They say, most hunter-gatherer groups obtain more than 50% of their calories from meat, and that, therefore, modern starch-heavy and sugar-heavy diets have a much higher proportion of carbohydrates and lower portion of proteins than was typical in the past. So in other words, some researchers argue that we're getting too much carbohydrates in our diet, so that's like sugars, and we need to be getting more protein and more meat. Okay, these particular authors don't necessarily agree with that. They say that honey, which is sugar heavy, of course, accounts for a substantial portion of the diet for many hunter-gatherer groups. They say among the Hadza, it's one of the populations, These researchers have estimated that honey accounts for about 15% of energy, ranging monthly from 1% all the way up to 50%. So these people are eating a lot of honey, which is, again, that's sugar rich, also has a lot of micronutrients in it, which probably contributes to their superior health. So they talk about how there's a debate about the macronutrient content. Again, that's proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. They say it seems clear that they are micronutrient rich, the diets of hunter-gatherers. And micronutrients, that's things like vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients. They say hunter-gatherer diets are micronutrient rich and likely more healthful than diets in industrialized populations. I think that's obvious. Another important dietary difference is they say hunter-gatherer diets also contain a higher portion of dietary fiber than typical modern diets. Okay, so like 5 times or more. So they say fiber intake of Paleolithic populations has been estimated to be 100 to 150 grams per day of fiber, which is much greater than the around 20 grams per day typical in the United States. So fiber, that's important for helping you digest your food and absorb nutrients. So, of course, having more fiber is going to be good for your body. Okay, they go on to talk about a few other differences. So there's differences in like glucose content, cholesterol content, triglycerides, fat content, all kinds of specific details. The point is their diet is extremely variable and it seems to be rich in micronutrients, which is a key difference between them and us. So in terms of their conclusions and what we can learn from this is an important point that they probably should have made a bigger deal about, but they say it's definitely their environment, the hunter-gatherer's environment, that's causing them to be healthier rather than their genetics. And the reason they know that is because there are studies, and maybe we'll cover one in a future video, where if you take hunter-gatherers out of their natural environment and you place them in developed society, they will develop the metabolic and cardiovascular diseases like obesity and heart failure at similar, if not greater rates than the modern populations. Okay, and then you can basically put them back in their natural environment and they will again become healthy. So it's definitely an environmental aspect. So if we're going to start improving our own population's health, we need to basically make our lifestyle more reminiscent of the natural lifestyle. Okay, so again, one of the key things there is more exercise. So they say here, the U.S. Center for Disease Control recommend more than 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And they say a goal that fewer than 10% of American adults achieve, which is a bit disappointing. And they say here, that recommendation might even be too modest, or we might need much more than that. So, most Americans, they aren't getting really any exercise. So that's a key reason that we're becoming less healthy by like every single metric. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead a little bit. They say, the idea that there is one true natural human diet to which we might all aspire is negated by the incredible variety of hunter-gatherer diets recorded by early ethnographers and researchers today. Okay, so while there might not be one specific diet that we should shoot for, we definitely need one with higher fiber and higher micronutrient density. Okay, I think it might not be that much about what macronutrients you eat. I think the more important thing is probably the micronutrients, like your vitamins and minerals. All right, and then finally here at the end, they say, it is worth considering what other aspects of traditional lifestyles, in addition to diet and physical activity, might contribute to the remarkable health of hunter-gatherers. Close friendships and family bonds, low levels of social and economic inequality, and lots of time spent outdoors are typical in hunter-gatherer populations and other small-scale societies. Okay, I would add to that lack of pollution. So in our society, pretty much everything you touch that's artificial, plastics, canned food, things like that, they've got artificial chemicals in them that are harmful to your health. Hunter-gatherer populations would be relatively protected from all that stuff because it's not in their environment as much. Okay, so that's probably another underappreciated cause of their better health. But with that, that's basically all for this paper. Again, the main takeaway is hunter-gatherer populations, natural populations, are healthier than we are by a wide variety of metrics. And this runs contrary to popular opinion. Most people are under the impression that we are the healthiest the human species has ever been. Again, that couldn't be further from the truth. We might be better off in terms of infectious diseases. We have lower rates of infectious diseases. But even that might not be a good thing because infectious diseases serve a quality control purpose, as I talked about. And we definitely have higher rates of chronic diseases. And this also, again, shows that nature is not inherently evil. So a lot of people, they become very unhappy with nature and disgusted by nature. And they view it as an evil, corrupt, broken, flawed system. And the reason they think that is because they see human disease and they think, wow, we're a poorly designed or suboptimal species living in a suboptimal world of chaos. Well, actually, that's largely an outgrowth of artificialization. That's not an innate aspect of the human condition. So nature is not evil. Our biology is not inherently flawed, at least not extensively. And the natural environment is very good for you. So we might dive into some of these topics in more detail in future videos, but thank you for listening.